All right, I'm going to admit everyone now.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's 8:30. We're going to get started right on time because we want to make sure that we end right on time today. Thanks so much for taking time out to be with us this morning. My name is Kim Ferrer. I'm from SR4 Partners. I've got the SR4 partner team here with me as well, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But welcome to our webinar on keeping teams connected and cohesive during a time of social distancing. I hope you have a cup of coffee and you found a comfortable spot. We're pretty excited about the next hour and a half, so let's kick things off. Before we get too far, we wanted to make sure that we just stopped and talked about how to best participate this morning. We realize that some of us are new to this virtual platform, some of us are pros, right? But just some best practices in how to participate today. So when you join, you want to make sure that you mute yourself. And the way you do that in this Zoom application is if you hover over the lower toolbar there on your screen in the lower left-hand corner, you can mute and unmute yourself. So we'll just ask that you mute yourself this morning, unless we ask you to unmute yourself and speak. And that way we can make sure that we can all hear each other the best we can. The other thing we'll ask is that we invite you all to turn on your cameras. So that way it makes us feel like we're all together, right? So you don't have to, and we know some of you are on the phone, but if you can, turn on your cameras so we can see your smiley faces. Otherwise, we also wanted to highlight the chat feature in Zoom. Once again, on the lower toolbar on your screen, you'll see chat. And if you want to go ahead and turn that on, we're going to be using that a lot this morning. If you have questions, we're going to ask that you pose those questions in the chat function. Even if you have feedback or comments during the session, we're open to that too. All right, we're also going to be using the breakout feature, and I don't want to make anybody nervous by this. It's very, very easy. Actually, there's nothing that you need to do. When we move to a breakout, you'll simply just have to click an accept button for the breakout, and we'll give you a couple more instructions, but all it is really is unmuting your mic so that you can talk to the person that's in your breakout. And the reason that we're doing that is because we really want to make today interactive. We just don't want to have an hour and a half of us speaking. And finally, I want to make sure that we make you all aware that we're going to be sending all of our materials out this morning. So you don't feel like you have to take notes the whole morning or take pictures of screens. Everything will be coming out to you in an email after the session today. And we're also recording today's session. And that's so if you want to go back and look at anything, or if you have a colleague who had a scheduling conflict, they can watch this after the fact. All right. So with that, I want to make sure that I introduce the SR4 team. So I mentioned that my name is Kim Ferrer. I have with me Abby Lewis, Kate Jones, Mike Lynn, and Aaron Jones. So I wanted to make sure to introduce the SR4 team. You'll probably be hearing from all of us this morning. Myself, Kate, and Mike are going to be facilitating this morning's webinar. Abby is going to be handling the chat feature. So all the questions that come in, you'll be hearing from Abby. And then Aaron's going to be behind the scenes, making sure that everything from a technical standpoint runs smoothly. So thanks, team, for being here. I should probably do a little brief introduction about SR4 as well. For those of you that are new to SR4 on the phone, welcome. We're super happy to have you here. You know, one of the things we think about at SR4 a lot is this research about only 34% of team members are fully engaged in their work. And we think about this because that's a lot of people that aren't fully engaged in their work, right? And it gives us pause, right? Because we know that everyone's trying to do the best that they can. And we truly believe that people are trying to do the best work they can all the time. And typically it's, it's organizational challenges that get in the way of doing that. And that's really why we exist. You'll see here on the screen, we exist to help improve organization-wide performance. And we do that through 4 focus areas. The first is building healthier leaders. The second is building more cohesive teams. The third is building thriving cultures. And then the fourth is an inclusive approach to change. So, it's interesting, over the last couple of weeks, we've been working with all of our partners on how COVID-19 is impacting the business. And it's really been a reminder that all of the approaches and things that we've been doing over the last 10 years have never been more important. So we're really excited to share more with you about that this morning. All right, so let's share some objectives about what we're planning on doing this morning. If you've worked with us before, we're really big on adult learning principles. And, how to make sure that adults can get the most out of an experience, any learning experience. And first and foremost, we always want to share why we're doing something. And that's why we always make it a point to stop and talk about what our objectives are for this session. So we have 4 for this morning. The first is to have an awareness of how social distancing might impact cohesion on your teams, right? This is all pretty new to us, right? It's happened pretty quickly. So we want to just talk about that. Separately, we want to have a discussion about how social distancing can cost your business if you don't manage it, right? Probably not the best time to sit back and see what happens, right? So we want to talk about that. The other thing is during registration, we heard from a lot of you that you'd like to have actual tips and tools on what to do during this time to help create more connection and cohesion on your teams. So we're going to make sure that's one of our objectives, to share tips for you on how you can, create those connections and cohesions on your team, especially during a time when a lot of us are working from home. And then our last objective is to have a fun and inspiring learning experience, right? We hope the next hour and a half is enjoyable. And I think it'll go by pretty quickly. We also want to share what the overview of the morning is going to look like here. Another one of our adult principles is just making sure that you understand the landscape of what's going to happen, and that's why we share the agenda. So right now we're in the welcome and orientation portion. From there, we're going to have a convening conversation, and this is something that we typically like to start with. There's a couple reasons why we do this. One, first and foremost, it's to get all of you talking, right? We don't want to be talking to you the whole time. We want to be having conversations. So a convening conversation allows us to do just that. So in a moment, we'll actually put you in breakout rooms, and we're just going to have a brief conversation, and I'll give you more instruction there in a moment. After that, and that also allows everyone to kind of get in the headspace of what we're talking about today. From there, we're going to switch gears, and Kate is going to take us through the business case for social connection. We've done a lot of recent research, as you can imagine, like as much as things are changing by the day or even by the hour, right? We want to share that business case with you. And then Mike will take us through actual tips. Our goal is that you can walk away here today with some really tangible things that you can start doing right away to help build connections on your team and help make your teams more cohesive, even when you're not together in the office every day. From those tips, we'll make sure to allow you some time to apply that to you and your teams through some discussion time. And then finally, we'll have a debrief and close. And we'll make sure that we're done at 10 a.m. this morning. So that's our agenda. The other thing I wanted to just mention, if you've worked with SR4 in the past, you've probably heard us talk about our meeting principles, and we apply this to everything we do, whether it's designing a learning experience such as this, it's putting together an agenda for a senior leadership team, or maybe it's even coaching. We always think if we apply these 5 things, we'll get the most out of our time. So I want to just take a brief moment to go through those. So the first is being present. And on a normal day, in a session such as this, being present means, yeah, you're all here, great, but mentally, physically being present, in a normal day, probably only 18 people are actually fully engaged and present in the session. And you can imagine with everything else going on in the world today, that number today might even be lower, right? So what are some of the things that we can do? What are some tips that we can do today to be more present? My tip, what I've learned over the last week, is wearing headphones on. It kind of keeps me more engaged. Some of the other tips are, looking at the camera, nodding, if you agree, agreeing, or thumbs up, what have you, but just staying engaged and being present that way. The next meeting principle is to create a healthy climate. And a lot of times when we give these, it's in person, and we talk about this one as, hey, if you need to stand up and move around, feel free. Obviously we're all virtual today, and I think we'd like to take a different spin on this because of that this morning, and just talk about the fact that, creating a healthy climate this morning might be that we're all human, right? And we all can sympathize with kind of what we're all going through, right? Some of us have been in our homes for a week and a half alone, maybe even longer. Some of us have been in our homes for, packed with people, children, trying to e-learn in the room next door to you, maybe even a partner trying to have a meeting next door. We have babies crying, we have dogs barking, but let's just all acknowledge we're all doing the best we can, right? So that's how we'll create a healthy climate this morning. Our next meeting principle is speaking your truths. We're really big on speaking your truth. It's not the truth, we want your truth. So this means, if you have questions, if you have comments, we want to hear them, right? Be a little bit vulnerable, get the most out of the experience. And that leads me to the next, which is taking ownership. Again, the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, we want you to get the most out of this as possible. So take ownership, ask questions during the session. We're going to do our best to respond to everybody, and the folks that we can't get to, we'll make sure to follow up with after this. And then finally, we always want to make sure that we have fun. We like to tell a story about one of our co-founders. His kindergartner came home. His backpack had a little note on it, and it basically said that kindergartners smile 400 times a day, which is pretty awesome. And then when that kindergartner goes to high school, they smile 100 times a day. So it goes down a little bit because high school can be stressful for all of us, right? And then it goes up to 150 times a day in college. It could go more depending on what college you go to, but essentially as an adult, we only smile 18 times a day. And maybe with everything that's going on in this world, maybe that number is even lower. So our goal is going to be to try and smile, I don't know, 25, 30, 100 times today. We'll see how we do. So having fun is our last principle. All right, so with that, I'd like to get started with the convening conversation. In a moment, we're going to put you into breakout rooms, and don't worry about that quite yet. I'll give you more instruction. I do want to explain this conversation first. So what we're going to ask you to do is to recall a story about a time when you were part of a team that felt one of these things. You felt the team members were connected, or they worked in lockstep towards achieving a common goal, or they trusted each other and felt they could share ideas openly. Okay, so I want you to think about a story about that, and what I want you to jot down or kind of take note of is what actions did you take, or what conditions were present to make those things possible? So what actions did you take with your team, or what conditions existed on your team to make your teams feel connected, or to help your teams work in lockstep towards a common goal, or to help your team feel like they trusted each other enough that they felt like they could share whatever, right, openly. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a moment to think about that and just jot down those actions and conditions. And then we'll come back and talk about the breakout rooms. All right, so as I mentioned, this is going to be pretty easy. There's not a whole lot for you to do. You'll just get a message that will pop up that if you accept, then you'll be placed into the breakout room. And the only thing I would ask is just that you unmute your mic so that you can talk to the person that you're talking to. And if you're able to, if you're on camera, if you can turn on your camera, that certainly helps the experience, but it'll still work for those of you that are on the phone. You will come back automatically, so there's nothing that you need to do or worry about there. The only other thing I'll mention is that a pop-up box will come up on your screen towards the end of the conversation, and we're just going to give you a couple minutes here. But at the end of the conversation, you'll get a pop-up with a counter, a countdown, if you will, so that you can make sure that you end your conversation before we all join back here. Okay, so with that, I'll send you off to the breakout rooms, and I'll see you shortly.
Hey, Melissa, can you hear me?
I can. I went to a breakout, but both of the participants were doing not video and mute.
Oh, okay. That's so. Well, you and I can do it.
I just came back. That's all.
We can do it together. I'm Erin from SR4.
Nice to meet you. I'm from Blue Orbit Consulting.
Nice to meet you, Melissa. Do you have a story that you wanted to share?
Sure. In terms of a team working with and feeling connected, I was doing a lot of work with a startup for about 2 years that was using EOS as the operating system. And one of the conventions for meetings, even the hard ones, was to have like 5 minutes at the beginning where everyone just went around and said what personally had happened that they were excited about, over the past couple days, one professional thing they were excited about, and so on. And it just kind of gave a good transition to get into the meeting and helped everyone know each other a little bit better.
Yeah, that's nice. I'm familiar with EOS and some of those things of making sure that like you level set at the beginning and
Right.
do all that. I'm working with a group where we're working on the development of values for an organization. And early on, we made sure that everybody, it was a 500-person organization that's part of a much larger organization. And early on, we made sure that people shared some of their personal values as we started to embark on the journey of creating values for the organization. And I feel like it was incredible how quickly people were willing to share those, like welcome the opportunity to share those professionals.
Yeah.
And were really vulnerable in how they shared those and like why those had become their values. And I just think that we are rewarded for, organizations want us to implement really quickly, but if we can go slow at the beginning to go a little bit faster later on, like investing the time and energy and creating that psychological safety and that trust is really kind of key.
Yeah, it's interesting. I also think that how people participate in stuff like that cuts across generational lines. So, not to date myself, but I started working in an age where you didn't share any information,
Yeah, of course,
right? And the separations between personal and professional were pretty sharp, right?
Yeah.
And harsh. And in working with some of my large corporate clients, you still see that gamut of, hey, we're just here to talk about work. But with some of the smaller startup clients, it's very interesting among kind of millennials and Gen Z, how the filters are different, right?
Yeah.
And the expectations are different about what kinds of information you share and what makes you feel connected to people. So I've done a lot of thinking about how to incorporate that into meetings, because what works for someone that's 25 is not going to work for someone that's 60 without a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely. To find some of that. Yeah, I think that those conversations do definitely create some of that, like it helps across generational, and like allowing people to see some of that is really nice. So
Yeah, it's interesting. Looks like some other folks are coming back too.
yeah, I think so. I'll bring them back in just a moment here. I just had one technical request, but I don't think I can quite help with it. So we'll bring everybody back.
Are you the technical expert then?
Well, today, yes. Today, yes, that's the role I'm playing, but not always. So
I've never seen the breakout function on Zoom. I use Teams and GoToMeeting a lot more than Zoom for work.
yeah,
I've become a power Zoom user in the past 2 weeks.
yeah, well, this is new for us in the past 2 weeks also. Like we always had it, but we weren't fully using the functionality of it.
Cool.
And so, yeah, we wanted to make sure we were demonstrating all the capabilities as everyone's trying to figure out, what's the best way to organize groups as well. Part of our goal is certainly to do that.
Cool.
All right, I'm going to give everybody here 30-second warning or so. It's nice to meet you, Melissa.
Nice to meet you also, Erin.
How did you learn about the webinar?
So one of my clients, Chris Horsman, who's also on the call, is with Granger. And I think SR4 had done some facilitation for Granger. And
Yep.
he sent it to me, given that he and I both have run and facilitated a lot of North American and global projects. He sent me the link and thought I'd find it interesting.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, Granger's a client of ours as well. So, all right, I'm going to bring everybody back on in, and they'll join us in the next 30 seconds here.
kind of comes into play alongside of that.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had a nice chat with your breakout partners there. So once again, we were talking about, with the actions and the conditions that were present to make those things possible, to make your teams feel connected, to make your teams feel like they, are all working towards achieving a common goal, and to those conditions that existed that really allowed your team members to feel trusted and feel like they could share things openly. So what I'd love to do is ask you to once again open the chat feature. And if you wouldn't mind just sharing a couple comments about your conversations, so that way we can share with everyone. What were some of the things you talked about? We'll just give it a minute here and see what comments come through the chat. As we're doing that, I'll just share our conversation. We talked about, not blaming others and really all working towards a common goal, just all being really aligned and working on solving problems together as opposed to blaming people. I've got this comment. Thank you, Kate. Friends first, most important. Trust, no judgment from Jules. Trust and psychological safety. Hi, Amy. Yeah, great comment, right? Like feeling like you can say whatever you need to say and work through problems together. Respect. Thanks, Alice. That's a great one. Respect, share, and show, and learn every day. Lisa, allowing vulnerability, right? Like being vulnerable can be really powerful, right? Especially in building trust amongst your team. Okay, well, thanks again so much for sharing, and thanks for kicking this off with the convening activity. I think we're going to turn things over to Kate now and let her start to dive into the business case. Kate?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. All right, so we're going to start with some research. And the reason why we start with some research or sort of building the business case for whatever it is we're talking about is because adults really need to understand why something is so important, right? They need to uncover the reasoning, the thought process, the strategy, all of that kind of stuff so they can understand the why behind whatever it is we're talking about. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do here. Recent research explains why being intentional about keeping teams connected and cohesive is so, so important. Companies are uniquely positioned to help people create social connections. I love this theory, and it comes from somebody with a lot of credibility. This belief was prompted former United States Surgeon General Murthy to write a Harvard Business Review article on the topic in 2018. He says that our understanding of biology, psychology, and the workplace calls for companies to make fostering social connections a strategic priority. Loneliness or a lack of social connection isn't just bad for our health, it's also bad for business. And researchers from Gallup also found this to be true. They found that having strong social connections at work makes employees more likely to be engaged with their jobs, produce higher quality work, and then less likely to be sick or get injured. Without strong social connections, these gains can become losses for the company. Connection can also help indirectly by enhancing somebody's self-esteem, self-efficacy, while also shifting our experience toward feeling good or positive emotions. All of this can help buffer somebody, create kind of a barrier during stressful situations and have positive effects on health and well-being overall. Lydia Denworth's research on positive social relationships, that defines loneliness as the mismatch, and I really like this, the mismatch between what people want and what they get socially. So what we know is that loneliness is a growing health epidemic. We live in the most technologically connected age, right, in the history of civilization. We all have, look at us today, we're on a webinar with each other and we're not even in the same place as each other. I saw people from St. Louis and Kansas City and, all across the Midwest at least. So we're all connected in this, new way of being connected, yet the physical, being further apart physically leads to loneliness rates that have doubled since the 1980s. Today, over 40% of adults in America report feeling lonely, And research suggests that the real number might be well higher because, you know, it's self-reported. Additionally, the number of people who report having a close confidant in their lives has been declining over the past few decades. And in the workplace, many employees, including half of CEOs, report feeling lonely in their roles. We also know that lonely workers are unhealthy workers. Over thousands of years, the value of social connection has become baked into our nervous systems, such that the absence of such a protective force creates a stress state in the body. So loneliness, just being lonely, is a stressful experience for people. According to the former Surgeon General, loneliness actually shortens lifespans in a way similar to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So just think about that for a second. We all know what 15 cigarettes a day can do to us, and loneliness can actually do the same thing. Loneliness causes stress, and long-term or chronic stress leads to more frequent elevations in a key stress hormone called cortisol. It's also linked to higher levels of inflammation in the body. This damages blood vessels and other tissues, which then increases the risk of heart disease, diabetes, joint disease, depression, obesity. You see where I'm going with this. Chronic stress can also hijack your brain's prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making, planning, emotional regulation, analysis, and abstract thinking. If you can't plan, analyze information, or make decisions effectively because you're in a state of chronic stress, how effective do you think you'll be at work? Probably not very effective at all. And that's why isolation in the workplace is costly. At work, loneliness or the lack of social support can lead to mental sluggishness that impairs productivity, stifles creativity, and hinders decision-making. This directly impacts a company's revenue, spending, and organizational performance. The mental and physical effects of social isolation can also lead to higher costs for sick leave and health insurance claims too. So it's not good in a variety of different ways for the organization. On the flip side, positive social relationships strengthen self-esteem and self-efficacy, engagement, employee retention, and productivity. This then positively impacts an organization's bottom line. The modern workplace is inadvertently contributing to the challenge. Telework and contracting arrangements offer employees flexibility, and for many, including me, an improved quality of life. But they also increase isolation and decrease a sense of belonging. Even in communal office environments such as like open floor plans, co-working spaces, that kind of thing, most workers are focused much more on productivity today and task completion too, leaving much less time for building social connections with each other. And guess what? That's under normal circumstances. We are not living under normal circumstances. I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, we'd like to share what we at SR4 believe about cohesive teams. So teams do better work. Real teams, not just work groups, should be the basic unit of performance for most organizations, regardless of company size. We define teams as a small group of people who share a common goal and responsibilities, are dependent on each other, and who are collectively evaluated or judged. Teams get better results than individuals in work groups. Cohesive teams, and this is important language that we'll be using further, cohesive teams get even better results. People want to feel like they belong. It's easier to identify with and foster a sense of belonging with a team than a broader organization. And we think it pays to invest in teams so that they can become cohesive, not just for the sake of team members, but also for the organization too. In our work at SR4, we focus on creating cohesive teams. Cohesive teams are psychologically safe. So thanks to those who are already starting to use that phrase. I saw that in the chat. Which means for us that they share ideas openly and can be vulnerable with each other. We got this definition after reviewing research from Google. Google conducted a study of its teams back in 2016 and found that the highest performing teams had these 5 traits. Psychological safety was most important though. Far more than the others, teams that were psychologically safe performed better, had more innovative solutions, and enjoyed less turnover. Teams felt like they belonged and were valued, or team members felt like they belonged and were valued in this study, and so they stayed. Retention was much higher on psychologically safe teams. We also know that cohesive teams can overcome the 5 dysfunctions of the team as defined by Patrick Lencioni. Those dysfunctions are absence of trust, fear of conflict, lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and inattention to results. They build from the bottom. For instance, you have to develop trust or a sense of psychological safety among team members before you can start work on overcoming a fear of conflict. Cohesive teams also have healthy leaders. Healthy leaders get the best out of themselves and the people they lead. Leaders need to first be thriving on a personal level before they can inspire others. In our work, we've seen the trickle-down effect. Employees look to managers for cues about how to react all the time, but especially in high-stakes, stressful situations or during times of change. Effective leaders who have control over their emotional intelligence take a 2-pronged approach, both acknowledging the stress and anxiety that employees might be feeling, but also providing affirmation of their confidence in their teams and in the organization. Feeling supported by their leader, team members are more likely to take up a challenge with a sense of purpose and focus. Finally, cohesive teams act with agility. Because they are high functioning and have healthy leadership, cohesive teams are also able to deliberately shift modes depending on the challenge they are tackling. Yet, even for teams that have the ability to change, changing habits is challenging. It can be tough to work on a distributed team and manage others working remotely, and harder still to change the habits of how teams communicate and collaborate. There's often a gap between the few who make the decisions and the many who must act on the decisions of the few. To get the many on board, they need context, and this is really important. They often need a lot of context. Providing context to build awareness, create deeper understanding, and develop a sense of ownership will increase engagement, making it more likely that people will embrace what is happening and change their habits. Those who want to cultivate effective distributed teams need to be cognizant of how they can close the interpersonal gap that exists when they aren't co-located with their colleagues. It'll take time. It's going to take a lot of practice. But by making an effort to build empathy with colleagues and create moments of connection across a variety of situations, people can bridge this gap and improve team performance, no matter where in the world their coworkers are located, or in our case, how long it takes until we can all be back in the same rooms together. There's one more piece to this too, and that is that change involves humans, and humans have emotions. This is the change curve from Kubler-Ross. Our emotional reactions to change are similar to how we experience grief. My guess is some of us might be seeing ourselves already on this change curve right now. We must plan for emotional reactions during times of change. In general, the emotions we experience range from denial to anger to exploration to acceptance. People need time to process and feel how they're going to feel. They will often need guidance and structured opportunities to reflect on their own feelings and connect with others. It's important to check in with your emotions and realize that colleagues may not be in the same place as you. A team member who is resisting the change between stages 1 and 2 needs something very different from his or her manager than someone who's showing signs of optimism and ideas between stages 2 and 3. As we've talked about, when people experience fear and anxiety during stress and change, it decreases their ability to function. You should expect that people's productivity will go down during this time. Focusing more on performance metrics when people are stressed adds pressure, also adds fear, which will have increasingly negative outcomes. Remember how we said that these are not normal circumstances? Well, now we're going to talk about that. COVID-19 is making us change our habits quickly. It's creating stress and keeping us apart, which makes keeping people engaged and teams connected and working cohesively even harder. We are preventing COVID-19 spread in communities by shutting things down and physically distancing ourselves from family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Who had even heard of social distancing 3 or 4 weeks ago? I know I hadn't. As we now know, social distancing is one of the community mitigation measures that is recommended during viral pandemics like this one. Social distancing can reduce virus transmission by increasing physical distance or reducing frequency of congregation in socially dense community settings, such as school or workplaces. Social distancing is important so we don't all get COVID-19 at the same time and max out our healthcare system. It also drastically limits opportunities for social connection. What people miss when they're not together? Well, they miss each other. According to recent research from Gensler, people who work in an office spend 8% of their time socializing. 8% might not seem like that much. And going back to Murthy's research in the beginning, that number has been declining, but 8% adds up over time. When people are not together, they miss the sporadic moments of connection, casual human interaction, the accompanying sense of belonging, and the surge of energy that at least I feel when we work in an office with our colleagues. If you can't bring people together physically, then it's important to counterbalance the deficit with more frequent and in-depth interactions that intentionally, and that's important, intentionally fill in the gaps by helping them get to know one another and build trust and psychological safety so that they can start working more cohesively. If they typically spend 8% of their time socializing with their teammates when they're in the office, that adds up to about 38 minutes a day. We need to create habits that allow us to spend at least the same amount of time socializing and building positive social connections when we are not together, so we can avoid feeling lonely and isolated. What those habits are will vary by organization, by team, and individual. They will also change over time. What our team members needed last week is probably different than what they need today, and also likely depends on their living situation. Make sure to ask your colleagues what healthy social relationships look like daily and facilitate them virtually. Listen, ask questions, find out what they care about. You might hear yourself asking a lot of questions like, how are you doing? What do you need? And how do I make it possible for you? And that's just the beginning. Now you know why being intentional about creating connections is so important. It's so important to keep your teams working cohesively, especially during a time like this. When you registered for this webinar, many of you mentioned wanting tips and suggestions for keeping people engaged and connected and teams cohesive. I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Mike, now, who will take us through some tips on how to work together when we're not together. But if you have questions or comments, I saw a lot coming in via chat, keep those going. We'd love to hear any thoughts that you have about the research that I've shared so far. And we'll weave those into the tips that we get from Mike here in a minute.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, we're all in this situation. We're trying to find the best way that we can foster these relationships because we've already known it's so important, and the research just reinforces that. You can see many of us are in the situation like the woman on the screen. Her assistant there is clearly very connected and demonstrating good eye contact, but there's a lot more that we can do to be better team members and to connect with one another. at a high level, we're talking about a few different forms of connection. So the first part is just getting getting connected, and what are the logistics? How do we make sure that we have the opportunities to connect with people in the way that we need to? Being connected is about using the right technology. And here today we get a chance to explore Zoom. Many of you used that before. We're all finding new ways to use platforms like this. We're going to focus especially in our tips on how do we feel connected, getting to know one another, building trust, all those human elements of being connected within our work that are going to be so important as we continue in this new era. So let's look at 4 aspects of what feeling connected might mean. And as you think about all of these, think about the relationships that you have with your family and your friends and just people who are in your relationships. How we're all trying to, have absence make the heart go fond, or as the last screen said. We're all trying to be able to do a little bit more, a little bit extra. And I know for myself, I'm doing a lot of that with my own family and relationships. We're going to try to do that with our colleagues and team members as well. So the 4 ways that we'd think about that, these are different roles that any of you might play. All of us are team members. We're all trying to be the best participant and contributor to the work that we're doing in the context of all these new stresses and realities. We all should try to be the best buddy that we can be. Being a buddy is about fostering those friendships, nurturing, doing a little bit extra, especially for those people on your team who might need that little bit of extra help. Some of us in the room are managers, or maybe just implicitly team leaders, team managers, trying to drive other people to success and helping them thrive. And there's many more things you need to think about in this distant world to help with that, and we'll address that. And some in the room are leaders themselves, thinking broadly, organizationally. What are the systemic issues that we need to think about? How do we address this within our culture? We're going to give you some tips for each of these, but any of you might relate to any one or several of these at any given time. Let's start with the team members. Each of you being team members, and some of you might have your other assistant, not your cat, but maybe your child there with you right now. Whatever it is, we're all in this reality, as Kim said earlier. Let's try to find ways to foster that sense of informal conversation. The first way to do that is just being present. Simple things like unmuting your microphone in a team meeting, not to be distracting. Obviously, if there's sounds in the background, you can mute it. But saying things like, yeah, good idea when you're in a smaller team meeting. That helps people recognize that you're there, you're tuning in, you're paying attention. Unfreeze your face. Don't just stare at the camera. Have some expression, maybe do a little bit more exaggerated. People like to feel that sense that you're there. And that means unfreezing your neck. Sometimes even just nodding your head can be helpful. If you shift to just the idea of video, we have this ability in Zoom and other platforms to be face-to-face and shorten that distance with video. So how are you expressing what you're hearing within facial cues? You're there, you're in person. It's not just some disembodied faraway voice. And if you're leading in, you're engaging, those are all visual cues that we tune into when we're in person. We want to try to do as much of those as we can in this video world. Finally, just this idea of being a tribe. We all have tribal tendencies. We want to be connected. We want to find ways to have that sense of relationship with other people, that human relationship. So it's not just about work. Just like when you're in the office, you can enjoy coffee conversations, walking down the hall, talking about something that you did. The work still gets done, but that creates those relationships, building rapport, talking about the personal things that happen in your life. Maybe starting a meeting with an open-ended question of not just, you could say, what did you do this weekend might be better than how was your weekend? How was your weekend might be good, okay, but what did you do is more specific and get a little more details. All of these are ways you can foster that sense of human connection. And that lets us build to the next idea, which is how can you be a buddy? Not just being connected with one another. If you think about those friendships, those people that are in your life or closer coworkers, they're people that they help you when you need it, you help them when they need it. And there's different aspects of being a good buddy that are all things, the important things that we learned in life, that we learned back in kindergarten. How do you get those more quiet people involved? How do you listen actively, appreciating differences? If there's someone who's more removed, even more removed than you, they might be on a different project or having different time zone, do what you can to not exclude them. Or if they're more quiet, you could bring them in. What I'd like you to do in this moment is think of a buddy boost. I'd like you to think of someone that you could be a better buddy to. And we're going to use some of the tools to help you do that. If you click on viewing options at the top, it lets you have a screen that has annotation. I'd like you to click on a stamp where you can click on the gold star. We're going to give you a chance to pick one way that you'd like to help a buddy from the list that's on the screen, and place your star next to the one that you think you're going to do with that particular buddy. When you've done that, click the red X at the top to get rid of the annotation screen, and that will let you click on the screen in the bottom with the chat window. We'd like you to share what your specific tactic's going to be for that buddy. You don't have to talk about the specific person, but what will you do to be a better buddy for that one person? So if you could do that now, place your star, and then when you're done, use the red X so you can go to the chat window and then place a comment in the chat window about what you will do to help a specific buddy. Seeing lots of good thoughts. It seems like learning about others and honoring emotions is a popular one, or two popular ones. As you're getting prepared to share your comments in the chat window, again, you can just use the red X to remove the annotation menu, and you'll be able to use your chat window on the bottom. Learning about others is important. Get to know others on a more personal basis. Checking with a work buddy. This idea of learning about others is especially important. We sometimes don't even know those people who we're working with when we're in the workplace. You have to make effort. You have to invest time and reach out to those individuals. So try to do that. Checking in with that work buddy is going to be something that you all need to be mindful in doing. I see someone said starting meetings by checking in, taking that moment in time just to say, hey, how's everybody doing? We're all going through a hard time. All of these can be helpful. I'd like you to just think about this, to take a moment and hopefully beyond this webinar, you can find a way to do at least one extra thing. Take a little bit of time to help that one buddy, and even better than that, do that for several people. Let's shift gears to talk about the role of managers. For a manager, in addition to everything else you have going on and trying to drive the work of the team, you want to make sure that you're able to enable the connection that we're talking about. And a manager might do any number of things to be enabling that. Things that if they're not done, that connection might not happen. And so a manager can do any of the items listed on screen. If you click on your participant window, you have the opportunity to raise your hand. What I'd like you to do is pick one of these. If you've seen a manager do any of these, or if you're a manager yourself and you've tried to do any of these tactics over the past couple weeks, we'd like to hear how that went. That also means you're going to need to unmute. So if you could click on the bottom left corner, I think at this point we're all muted. So if you can raise your hand and share something that you've done or that you've seen done, a manager to help a team, please raise your hand using the raise hand button in the participant window, and we'll hear some examples of that. Matt, I see you've raised your hand. If you can unmute your phone, might you share what you've seen a manager do or what you've tried?
Yeah, so we're in product development, so we have daily stand-ups, daily huddles, all of those with the dev teams, and I run the product org. But we realized really quickly was we were disconnected from each other. We were all really good working hand in hand with our teams, but not with each other. So we've instituted a 3-day-a-week, kind of scrum of scrums, stand up amongst the product managers so they can reconnect because they were drifting apart pretty quickly. And they've all loved that, just being able to see each other.
Yeah, just a little bit of extra and making that something that you do on a regular basis can be very helpful. Alice, I see that you raised your hand as well. Do you want to share what you've seen?
I did. Good morning. I wanted to share that I think it's really important to meet that person at their level of need. So I think with a team of people, when you're managing everybody to a goal, specifically a metric-driven goal, they work differently and they're motivated differently, and really understanding that person's individual needs and what motivates them is really critical in success. And so I think being a good leader, bringing that forward and letting them share how they like to be communicated to, how they like to work, what their processes are, really empowers them to do their best. And so I think when you have a team of 5 or a team of 50, trying to understand them as people first is really critical.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And especially in this time, we have to be able to do that.
Mhm.
Are there any others that want to offer something you've experienced or something you've done as a manager? I saw Sperry said this is the time you're actually getting to know people all the more, right? And just making those efforts to reach out. So if you're a manager in the room, you have this list. And again, we're going to be sending our list of tips after the session. So you'll have all of these, everything we're talking about. If you're in a good relationship with a manager and they might be trying to find the right tips to help the team, you might share some of these as well. I think the more we can help one another, that's going to help everybody to be healthy and connected. The final aspect of being connected is being a leader. We want to think about the people who are helping at the organizational level. Some of you in the room are doing that. Some of you asked for systemic issues. How can we drive this at a more broad level rather than just more the day-to-day, week-to-week tactics? And again, if you're not a leader yourself, these are things you can share with your leaders. The leaders in this world are the people who are helping to drive a massive change that's going on. And organizations are dealing with change all the time, but right now, in the past few weeks, change has been happening very, very quickly. So leaders have to think actively about how they're going to engage in that. The first way that a leader might address this type of change is just being clear about the shared vision and the norms. What are we trying to do now as a group? Where are we going? How are we dealing with all of this in a very specific way? The more you can get in front of that and share that with everybody, it lets everyone also have that sense of cohesiveness and a unity of mission. The sense of norms is important, but sometimes those norms might be generated at the team level. So if you can enable your teams to generate the norms of what might be the best way to operate with one another, if you're trusting them to do the work, you as a leader can enable that and then share those, make sure that everyone knows what those norms are once they've been established. The next aspect that we're thinking about as a leader is communication. And we already heard a lot of that in the comments, that we want our leaders to communicate with us as clearly as possible. And Kate talked about just, especially in this time, COVID-19, what is going on? How are we dealing with it? And there's so many questions. We're almost information overloaded from the news, but we need our leaders to be able to say, here's how we're approaching it with some regularity and making sure it's clear for everyone. And part of that is knowing what your employees need, being able to be clear of what information is out there, what are the questions that are being asked. It might mean having all team sessions periodically, just to be able to inform people, because the world is moving so fast. Even last week seems like a month ago. So having those regular sessions to communicate can be helpful. And don't forget your managers. The managers, as we talked about, have a lot to do. They're trying to foster this sense of connection and enablement, and they themselves are going through the change. So you want to make sure that they have what they need. They are able to respond to questions as they need to. The next aspect that leaders have to think about is culture. We always advocate for having a thriving culture. You want to be deliberate about how you're setting the cultural approach. What does that mean for the behaviors within the organization? And we want to make sure that in this time we're taking the pulse as well. It doesn't have to be any formal, long research study, but some quick polls, some informal discussions with people on your teams can help you to understand what is going on in terms of the culture, and is it matching what you really want within the organization. The last piece, and we've been talking about this as a common theme, is the behaviors that help individuals get connected. We've already talked a lot about empathy, understanding that we're all in the same place, understanding the stresses and anxieties that people are dealing with, being able to recognize that feelings and the uncertainty is important in this time. Telling your team that they're doing a great job, trusting that they're going to get done what they need to, that you believe in them, that they can get through this tough time. And just being vulnerable. Sometimes the hardest thing for a leader to do is to not be a superhero. Recognize that you're challenged, you're sometimes frustrated. The best leaders convey that vulnerability. As we think about all these aspects of leadership, we'd like to go back to the change curve that Kate introduced earlier. All of us are at different stages of this change curve, and a leader's job is to help advance that change, not to force it, but to just nudge the organization along so people can move from the harder parts of that change to more positive approaches and getting through it and trying to find a more positive way to get through what's ahead. What we'd like you to do is go back to that annotation function at the top of the screen again. The viewing options are at the top. If you click the annotation option, you can click a heart or a check or a star. You could choose, but place your stamp on the place in the change curve that you feel like you are at this moment in time. How are you addressing the change? We'd like you to use a stamp just to place how you're feeling about it. And then as you're doing that, once you've placed your stamp, again, if you click the red X at the top of the annotation screen, and then go back to the participant window, go back to the chat window, and enter what you would like leaders in your organization to do to help move you along. And if there's leaders in the room, I'm sure they'll appreciate hearing this in general. And these are also things you can share with people, things to help us move along in the curve. I am very, very happy to see from at least the group that has stamped so far that we're all not here. We're moving towards the transition, right? We all know we want everyone to be healthy. We want our loved ones to be safe. So we're accepting this change that's happened very quickly in the past couple weeks. And many of us are in these two categories, including several that are already moving forward, new beginning. Let's just keep going and let's do this the way that we need to. I love that sense of positive enthusiasm. We had a webinar the other day with another group, and there were many people who were in this searching, anxiety, uncertainty time. What do we do with this? And all the rules of mindfulness, just meditation, taking breaks, exercise, all of that can help someone progress from all of these kind of mid-level change states to a little more of a positive sense, optimism and ideas. And I'm really glad to hear people are doing that. So again, I'll ask you to list things you'd like to see leaders do. I'll call a few of those out. Nick said, you just need the support you've been getting. It's nice to sort through this with the help of my manager. So I'm glad to hear that your manager's already been mindful about this. They've been already on top of things prior to all of this happening. And then Alice said, thoughtful communication, clear expectation, and empathy. So thoughtfulness is going to be all the more important for everybody, but leaders especially need to be mindful and deliberate in the way that they're interacting. And again, empathy sometimes requires that sense of, I'm going to mindfully make some choices about how I'm going to connect with people. We also had clear prioritization of new focus areas that have come as a result of COVID impact the industry. It's not just the interactions with one another, it's our work is changing, our customers are changing, the priorities are changing for our business to help make sure that we're continuing to do what we need to. And so being clear about that, because it's all changed versus 3 weeks ago, is going to be especially important. So we have some good tips. And again, I'm really encouraged that there are so many people that are in this right half of the screen. In fact, all of us in the room seem to be in the right half of the screen. And if you're the folks on this side at the far right, you are the ones who can help bring the rest of us along, right? And that's empathy, that's connectedness, that's being a buddy. And if you see someone that's maybe still a little anxious, maybe a little frustrated, share what you're doing to help them pull along. So we've addressed how to be a good team member. We've addressed how to be a buddy proactively, things managers can do to enable teams, and things leaders can do to make sure that they're helping all of this happen. So, and thank you so much for sharing all these tips. I saw lots of tips in the chat window that we didn't address specifically, but we will be sharing that as well as our own tips with you after the session. At this point, I'm going to pass it back to Kim, who's going to help us think about all the things we're talking about.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Kate, too, for taking us through the business case. So we just went through a lot of information, right? Talking about loneliness and how it affects the health and well-being of our teammates and employees, and how that affects productivity, and all of these tips from the different angles, whether it's being a team member, a buddy, a manager. So we want to spend a moment reflecting. Oh, Mike, did you want to go through this for a moment before I get to reflection?
I did. I'm sorry. This is our virtual world. I forgot that I wanted to do one more thing to share with you in the context
Sure.
of tips. So we are all, we shared lots of opportunities for tips across the 4 dimensions of being a team member, but here are some specific ones that might be helpful to everybody. So we talked earlier about those huddles, those regular huddles, and how that can be such a powerful tool Our team did an interesting exercise called the Inside Scoop, which we were doing already prior to this world, where team members can share something about themselves through pictures, something about their life maybe, or some interesting element of their life at the beginning of a meeting for the first 5 minutes. Don't forget to go for walks. I've seen people saying, let's not have any meetings during 12 to 1. Maybe we're gonna go out and have a walk and have a phone call, let people know that you're out there. It's a very easy thing to do, but something that we take for granted and that we shouldn't do. Do continue to ask how people are doing, ask how they're feeling. Don't just keep focusing on the work. And again, listen empathically. This is the theme of our whole session. It's just, we're wired to listen for connections. What does this person care about? What are they worried about? All of that goes back to this idea of absence, making the heart grow fonder. We want to make sure that we're all connected. And now we can bring it to, how do we bring this to our everyday life? Back to you, Kim.
Thanks, Mike. That was an important slide. I wanted to make sure we got to that. So, we just went through a lot of information. I wanted to bring up a comment on chat, just like, wow, this is kind of overwhelming, right? Like, I've got all these things to think about now on top of my day-to-day job. And oh, by the way, some of us are like now become teachers and are homeschooling and all the rest. So I think the goal of this session is really that, there's some probably small things that can make a big difference too, right? With the tips that Mike talked about today. So if you think about it just in small steps, if it all feels overwhelming, hopefully that might be helpful. We do want to take a moment just to reflect on all this information, the business case and all the tips that Mike just went through. And a friendly reminder, we will send out all this information, so you'll have it at your fingertips. But one of our best practices is after we teach something, we like to give some time for application, right? Like, what does it mean to all of you? Because you all have different teams, and some of this is will be a great idea, and some of this might not work for your team. So before we go through the reflection activity, I did want to just bring it back to the former Surgeon General Kate spoke about in his 2018 article. He had this call to action. I just want to take a moment if you could read this on your own. I think this really stood out to us, the last sentence, right? We must take action now to build the connections that are the foundation of strong companies and strong communities, and that ensure greater health and well-being for all of us, right? The other thing I just wanted to circle back to before we do our discussion here on all the information we went to is our convening conversation. There was a reason behind that, no surprise probably. We asked you just to recall a story about a team that you were on that either felt connected, worked together in lockstep towards a common goal, or trusted each other, had that psychological safety, right? They felt open to share ideas and didn't feel like anything would happen or, because of it, right? And we asked you to capture those actions and conditions that were present. And although I didn't see them on the chat, I would imagine if, maybe some of the breakout rooms, you talked about it, or maybe it was just going on in your mind, but a lot of us are probably thinking, well, a lot of this is because we're all together physically, right? Like some of these things just organically happen. So now we have to really be thoughtful about how to replace that and recreate that in this kind of new world that we're in. So with that, I do want to pose a prompt a conversation. And Erin, if you could go to the next slide. As a community, I was hoping that we could kind of help each other. And we could just think about what is one idea that you have that you want to contribute to, for all of us to helping each other keep teams connected and cohesive. And I've seen a lot of great ideas come over the chat. I will mention we're able to download the chat and we'll include this in the information we send out. But what I'd like to do is just give you a moment to think about this and just jot down what's one thing, one idea that you have to contribute here to keeping teams connected and cohesive. So I'll give you a moment to do that. And then we're going to send you back to your breakout rooms to talk about this, just to give you a moment to share your idea and learn from each other. And this will work the same way. You can unmute your microphones, make sure your cameras are turned on if you have them. I will mention in my breakout room, I did have someone who was on the phone and wasn't able to unmute. So if you're in that situation, the way we work through that is we chatted. we could chat separately to each other, like individually, and then I just read it aloud because they could see me and hear me. So I hope that helps. So we'll go to the chat, the breakout rooms now, and then we'll come back together to debrief the experience. Okay, see you.
If there's some folks here who would like to share, Erin's here, and I'd be happy to share some ideas.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing. Appreciate it.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Hope you had a good time in your breakout rooms. I'd love to do the same thing we did after the convening conversation. I'd love to just have you open up your chat feature if you can. And once again, that's on the lower toolbar there if you click chat. And I'd love for you to just, share with us. What's the one idea that you have that you want to contribute to this community here as far as an idea you have in helping each other keep teams connected and cohesive? Let's see what we have here. Getting to know everyone on my team more now since we've been at home. It's interesting, like getting to know people better. Thoughtful communication. Yep, we talked about that in my breakout room. Thoughtful communication being, even more communication than normal. We actually talked about like CEOs doing video messaging on a weekly basis, things to that extent. 15-minute daily touch-based sessions, right? Like maybe now starting off every day with a touch point with your team when you didn't have to do that before because it kind of organically happened. You walk into the office, you place down your stuff, how was your morning? And when you leave, you do that, but like having an intentional check-in so that you don't, not even about work, like, hey, how's your morning? What did you have for breakfast? Did you work out this morning? Whatever. And then you can start with your business. Trying to find things that are lighter and non-work related. Love that, right? That's like that 8% of what we do. I think someone earlier had the chat recommendation of the fun zone, like creating a Slack channel that's for fun so that we can get to know each other personally. Maybe you're sharing pictures of your home office or giving each other tours of your home office. Virtual meditation, love that. Like maybe you even start meetings with virtual meditation or a moment of well-being or checking in. Alice has shared something you did differently today to be more successful, right? Like sharing learnings with each other. That's great, Alice. I love that. Our team has been doing that too. Like, what have you guys been doing differently? Talking about just what have you done differently that's helped you kind of in the last week still be productive? What do you need from me to help you be productive is the question we keep asking each other. Let's see. Celebrating virtual birthdays. That's fun. Having like happy hours, right? Like virtual happy hours doesn't have to be like you could have your happy hour, anything drink, happy hour smoothie, live Zoom boot camps. All right, a lot of great suggestions. So thank you so much. Once again, we will make sure to share all these with everyone so that everyone has an idea of one thing that they can do to help keep their teams connected and cohesive during this time when we all can't physically be together. So typically when we're in a session like this, at the end, we pack up our bags and we have a chance to talk about, oh, hey, that was great. I really like this idea. Or, hey, I'm going to do this. And obviously working virtually, we don't have the opportunity to have that kind of end segment. So we wanted to be very deliberate about having a debrief moment within this session. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to think about 3 things. I'm going to ask you to think about what did you like about this morning? What did you learn this morning? And what will you take away from this webinar? And I'm going to ask you to use the chat function once again and just share an answer or 2 or 3 if you want. What did you like about this morning's webinar? What did you learn? And what will you take away with you? A new set of buddy calls where team members are randomly paired to talk on the phone or via Zoom about work life. Paul, I love that idea. That's fun. So Nick is sharing that he learned how important interaction is, how important interaction is and how my team functions. The daily Zoom stand-ups are essential to the team being productive. Yep, having a daily meeting and check-in might be more important now for some teams than ever, right? Thanks for sharing that, Nick. Let's see, Sarah said, I love the ability to create breakout rooms in Zoom. Great technology tip. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. We really like this too. We feel like this is a really great way to make meetings interactive, give people a chance to talk about things and process things and then come back together. So we were excited to try it out this morning. Abby's mentioning the stats on loneliness. Yeah, our team was really, I think that's something that really stood out to us in building the business case, right? this whole idea of how loneliness affects well-being, and how healthy you are, and how that ultimately affects your productivity, right? I think the main thing that stood out to all of us was this whole 8% that Kate brought up, right? This 38 minutes a day that we typically spend connecting with one another that we don't have right now, right? So like, how can we as team members, as leaders, as managers, recreate that 38 minutes? Seeing message of love using Zoom, ensuring folks feel connected. These are all great. So thank you so much for spending some time just to debrief this morning. That not only helps, I guess, you to think about your takeaway, but it also helps us to see what kind of resonated with the team here. I appreciate the tips, not only for managers and leaders, but also for team members. As we keep hearing, we're all in this together. That's absolutely right, Elizabeth. And a friendly reminder that we did record today's session. So if you have any team members that you want to send this along to watch, feel free to do that. That's why we recorded it. We'll also be sending out all these tips that Mike talked about and the chat, so you'll be able to have access to that. And feel free to send that along to everybody. All right, so with that, I think, just to reiterate, we went through a lot of information this morning. Again, I just talked about this, but I think this idea of loneliness and the connection, and how loneliness is already 40% plus, right? Adults, 40% of adults already report feeling lonely, and how that directly affects your health and well-being, which affects productivity. It's really all of us and our call to really help connect teams and build these cohesive teams. So it's up to us to do maybe one thing, right? And that's our hope, is that you leave here with kind of one thing that you can do to connect your teams and build more cohesive teams. So thank you so much for spending the morning with us. It was great to see all these smiling, familiar faces, and we appreciate it. I know I talked about the fact that all these materials will be coming out, so you'll receive an email later today with this information. Also included in the interview, or excuse me, in the email, is a survey. And we'll be doing this just because we want to get a grasp from you on how we did this morning, what can we learn from this, what can we do differently, and what other information might you be looking for during this time. So with that, on behalf of the SR4 team, thanks so much for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye, everybody.